with heat waves sweeping across Europe and talk of a super El Niño developing this year. And given that it's July, which is you can see, the middle of winter here in New Zealand, I thought today would be a good time to talk about temperature extremes and how they affect chickens. It's really important to know how to keep your flock safe and comfortable in the extreme heat and the extreme cold. Let's start by talking about heat and chickens, because chickens struggle much more in the heat than they do in the cold. Chickens are pretty cool with cold weather. I mean, they're walking around with little fluffy feather jackets all the time, but they really struggle in the heat. And that's something that people don't understand as much as they need to often. And as these big, high temperature, out of the blue events start happening, it's really important to be able to manage heat for your chickens. So chickens don't sweat. So the only way that they can dissipate their body heat if they start to get too hot is by panting like a dog, by radiating the heat from their feather empty areas, so their combs, their wattles, their beaks, their legs, and that's pretty much the only way they have of dissipating heat from their body. So when chickens are getting too hot to be comfortable, you'll see them lift their wings out away from their body so more air can circulate underneath them. You'll see them panting, and you'll see them being very still and looking for shady places to try and cool down, or at least not get any hotter. So that is something that's really important to keep in mind. Chickens have very limited ways to get heat out of their bodies, and high heat can rapidly become quite dangerous to them. Let's talk about some temperature ranges so you know when you need to start being a bit concerned about what the weather's doing. Now, all of these are in Celsius. So chickens have a slightly higher body temperature than humans do. They have a body temperature around 41 degrees Celsius, and they're quite comfortable cruising around at temperatures up to about 25 degrees. They're just living their best lives. It's all fine. They're doing okay. But as the temperature gets towards the high 20s, once it hits about 29 degrees, which is not particularly hot, and that's a common temperature here in the summertime, which is a fairly temperate place. It does get hotter than that, but 29 is not unusual. They're starting to enter mild heat stress at that temperature. And if the temperature gets way up there towards like 38 degrees and hitting 40 degrees, which is happening in Europe at the moment and does happen in summertimes, commonly in lots of places, they are not doing great at those temperatures. If you add some humidity into those mid to high 30 degrees days, they aren't doing great. They're actually entering an area of temperature that is physically dangerous for them. And if they're in a vulnerable state, if they're old or young, they could be entering into a fatally dangerous zone. So it is something that is important to have a plan for. And let's talk about what you can do to help your chickens stay cool. First thing to help keep your chickens cool in hot weather is having shade for them. And it needs to be deep shade. So what that means is that the sunlight isn't getting through into the shade and the cover is quite thick. So that is things like big trees and thick bushes that the chickens can get right in under and stay cool. And if you don't have that sort of a situation happening in your chicken run, it's putting up umbrellas and shade cloth and making sure that the shade that is available all day long. So as the sun moves, there's always going to be shade. Shade is the best and hopefully easiest strategy. And chickens should have shade no matter what all the time. It should be a component of their living environment always. But when that temperature starts to go up, it's really, really important that it is really heavy shade shade that they can all fit under. Remember, they might have little arguments about who gets to be near who and how close they're willing to get to each other. Chickens are chickens. They're not being concerned about whether their friend is out in the sun or not. So make sure that the shade on offer is deep and heavy and large enough for the number of chickens that you have to all fit happily underneath it. Making sure your chicken flock always has enough water is obviously going to be really important. They're going to drink more, and you want them to drink more in hot weather. And you want to encourage that drinking by trying to keep the water cool for them, like not icy cold, but cool, because water is going to heat up in those sorts of temperatures to a temperature that the chickens are not going to find as palatable. So making sure waters are in the shade, ideally close to the shade where your chickens are hanging out so they don't have to venture out into the searing sunshine to get their water. And you put it into an insulated drinker. They're a really good idea for temperature extremes because it will help to keep the water at a more palatable temperature for longer. And you can put ice cubes or ice packs into the water to help it stay cool as well. But you always want to make sure that you have a good large amount of water available and more than one waterer, because if anything happened to the waterer, that it failed or it got knocked over or the water leaked out, you want your chickens to have another source. So in this sort of high heat situation, you don't want to muck around. You want to make sure your chickens have water all the time under any circumstance. You can also use water to help keep the environment cooler for your chickens. So a great way to do that is to keep the ground moist in their run. So if they've got some soil or they've got their composting sort of wood chip, you can keep that bedding material nice and damp, moist for them. And they will dig down and sit in that nice, cool, moist little hole. My chickens in the summertime will dig under the trees and sit in little moist craters in the ground, and that is one way that they help to cool themselves down. So their legs and their bellies can get into that cooler zone, and their blood can cool down as it flows through their legs and the surfaces that are in contact with that cooler temperature. So that's a really great strategy. Get your hose out, get the ground wet, and let your chickens cool down in the earth itself. You can also put out little pans, shallow pans of water. Now, chickens may or may not use these, but chickens can stand in water to help their legs cool down, which will ultimately cool down all the blood in their body if they stand there for long enough. My chickens don't seem to like to stand in pans of water, but your chickens might. It might be a good strategy to get them used to a pan of water just hanging out in their run, so it's a very ordinary thing before the temperatures start to rise, so that they're used to that being there. And you can use water misters to help keep the area where your chickens are cool. Chickens don't love water droplets floating out of the sky onto them, but it is going to help keep all of the surfaces of their environment cooler for them, and they can just deal with it as far as I'm concerned in terms of their dislike for the mist, because it is going to keep them much, much more comfortable and safe as those temperatures get higher and higher. You also want to think about your chicken coop where your chickens are sleeping at night, because some chicken coops can heat up quite dramatically if they've got like metal roofs or things like that, and they might not be cooling down fast enough for when your chickens are heading off to sleep. So you want to open up every possible ventilation that you have available in your coop. You want to be getting that airflow moving through it so the heat can dissipate. And this is a situation where if you can, you might want to put some fans in the coop, because when temperatures get high and stay high, especially if they're staying high through the nighttime, there's not really like a break in that heat stress to sort of recover for the next day. So if you're in a situation where the temperature is just going up, the nighttime temperature is staying high as well, you really want to get as much airflow as possible happening in the chicken coop where your chickens are sleeping. And you got to remember that chickens are chickens. And even if you provide them with a different place to be than the coop for sleeping in sort of an emergency situation with high temperatures, they're still gonna go and sleep in their coop. They don't understand that that is physically dangerous for them to do. They'll just go and sleep in their coop. So do everything you possibly can to keep them cool at nighttime if you're in a situation where you're not getting a nighttime temperature drop. Really, really important to keep in mind their sleeping environment, because that's something that you can miss thinking about. But remember, chickens are suffering at temperatures much lower than where people are starting to get into physical danger from the heat. I think it's important to note that the breed of chickens that you have will influence how much they're suffering in the heat. So if you have sort of the Mediterranean breeds like Leghorns or Minorcas, they're probably going to be okay to higher temperatures than if you have a heavy, fluffy breed like an Orpington, who are going to start suffering earlier at lower temperatures. So remembering that chickens can only dissipate heat by panting or from the areas of their body where there are no feathers. If they have small combs, if they have small wattles under their chins, then they're not going to be able to dissipate heat as effectively. If they have feathered legs, then that's going to impact the areas that they can dissipate heat from. So keep in mind what kind of breeds you have, and if you have fluffy breeds with small combs, small wattles, or even no wattles, like an Orpington chicken doesn't actually have wattles because they have like a little muff instead, then you want to be on it earlier. You want to be out there with your heat management strategies to keep those chickens safe and comfortable. Okay, now let's talk about chickens and cold weather. Now, chickens are much more tolerant of the cold than they are of hot weather, so that is great. So long as chickens are dry, they can cope with temperatures well below freezing and just still be living their best lives. So the most important thing to consider when you're helping your chickens get through cold weather is that they can be dry and they have really well-ventilated shelter, particularly at nighttime. So let's talk about that nighttime situation, your chicken coop. You want to have some really nice, dry, absorbent bedding on the floor, like pine shavings or something like that, and you want to make sure it stays dry. So if your chickens are out walking through the mud or slushing through snow or generally kind of being wet when they come in, keep topping up your bedding so there's a dry layer, and just keep an eye on the actual level of moisture that it's holding, because it's all about keeping their environment dry. With your ventilation in your coop, you want to keep it open at the top along the roof line. Don't think, oh, we'll close it all in so they stay warmer. They're going to be warm. What they're going to struggle with is if moisture starts building up in the coop and dripping down on them. That's what you don't want. So open up those vents at the top, let that moisture out of the coop. Your chickens are going to be just fine with the actual ambient temperature being quite cool. A lot of people do just try and shut the coop up to keep it closed to sort of keep it warm, but you need the ventilation. It is super, super, super important. But you don't want drafts coming across your chickens at their sleeping height. So nice high ventilation, taking that moisture out above your chickens' heads while they sleep, not wind or drafts going across their bodies at the heights that they're perching at. And remember, your chickens sleeping at nighttime on their perches, they're going to hunker down with their fluffy sleeping bags. That is their whole feathery body. They're going to tuck their feet under their bellies. And if they're really cold, they're going to tuck their head under their wings. So they're good. They are warm. All the hot air that they're generating off of their bodies is being trapped in their feathers. And they're fine. They're toasty warm. Keep them dry. They're going to be just fine. fine. Chicken feathers lose the ability to insulate chickens well if they get wet. So your chickens are in danger from very cold weather if they get wet, and particularly if it is wet and windy. So you want to make sure you have a dry space for them, some shelter where they can get out of the rain or out of the snow or whatever's happening at your place and stay dry. And if they get wet, somewhere they can go to get dry. So that is one of the main considerations in helping chickens through cold weather, is making sure that they can stay dry. Now, I have seen for places that get very cold and snowy or really rainy, people using big tunnel houses as their winter quarters for chickens. And that's a fantastic idea. And if you live somewhere very cold, that could be a great solution. Put your coop into a big tunnel house and your chickens are good to go. But make sure you've got the ventilation open, because a tunnel house can heat up quite a bit if the sun comes out, and chickens are gonna struggle more in the heat than the cold. So make sure they've got plenty of airflow and they're dry and they're gonna be totally fine. Providing water for your chickens in the winter when it is cold can be challenging. So you want to look at waterers for drinkers that are insulated so they're not going to freeze. I know that there are heaters available that can go into drinkers to stop them from freezing. Now, I do not live somewhere that is cold enough that my chickens' waterers are going to freeze solid. They'll get a little bit of ice on the surface, but nothing that I need to worry about. So I'm not the best source of information for what's available for keeping water watery and not icy. But chickens like water at temperatures that is comfortable. So if the water is really, really cold, they're going to drink less of it than if it was a nicer temperature for them. So keeping water at the right temperature and not frozen is something worth thinking about for cold weather. Cold weather is usually easier to plan for than freak hot weather, because you're generally going to know that you live in a cold winter climate, whereas heat waves can kind of hit anybody. So with that in mind, having breeds that are suited for cold weather is something that's probably worth considering, because frostbite can be an issue on breeds that have very large combs and wattles. So thinking about like a Leghorn rooster has a really, really big comb that can put him at risk of getting frostbite. You can minimize frostbite risk by making sure that your coop is really well ventilated and it is staying nice and dry. But you really have to match the right breed for your climate in this situation. People tend to overestimate the effects of cold weather on chickens and underestimate the effects of hot weather. And hot weather is more the wild card these days. There's lots of lists on the internet about breeds that are good for hot weather and breeds that are good for cold weather. But if you're cruising in a place that's not normally that hot and suddenly you get hit with freak hot weather, you might have a breed that is more cold hardy than hot hardy. And that's why it's so important to sort of have those strategies ready to go. So plan ahead, make sure your flock has deep shade, always access to water, and some dry shelter, and your chickens are gonna be able to handle most of what nature throws at them.